pass the microphone between you, Brooks, and Elizabeth.
Hello. Okay.
Okay. Hello.
And then
Is this?
you can
Oh,
Right. Okay. Sweet.
yeah.
You like Ariana Grande?
I'm gonna hold it. Okay, it's frozen
No,
so I
I
can go see the
hold it.
questions.
Here.
I need to stop automating my face.
Imagine if it's.
Just announce yourself.
Imagine if it's just this. That actually.
are we
That should be okay. Yeah.
My students are going to put their phones away, right? Yes.
Is it um. Hello. Hi, everyone. And welcome to our last panel of the day. Our panel with queer voices of color at North. I'm Nat. I use any pronouns. I'm a junior. And I'm going to be moderating. If people want to introduce themselves really quick, feel free to do that. Are the microphones? Okay.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a sophomore.
Hi, I'm Soria. I'm a senior and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, my name is Brooks. I'm a senior and I use he, they pronouns.
Hi, my name is Amia. I'm a sophomore and I use they, she pronouns.
I'm Maisie. I'm a sophomore and I use she, they pronouns.
Thank you. I'm Mr. George. I use the he, him pronouns, and I'm a super senior. I'm just kidding. I'm a teacher here at North.
Great. And also for people watching the live stream, if you have questions at any point during this panel for the panelists, we have this QR code that you can fill out that brings you to a form where you can submit questions to ask. And with that, we should just jump right in. And our first question is, how would you say that your identities, both being queer and a person of color, how have both of those identities influenced your life?
So in terms of my identity, I identify as a queer trans man, and I also identify as Black. And I think for me, as a trans man who is Black, I lived a lot of my life as a Black woman. And when you live a lot of your life as a Black woman, you learn to kind of fight to be viewed as feminine and viewed as a woman, because traditionally Black women are really masculinized, involuntarily so. So I think it was very difficult for me to sort of cope with being a trans man and actually sort of wanting to be masculine and perceived as masculine, because it was something that was always sort of forced on me by racists and people who were microaggressing me. And then additionally, I just feel like throughout my life, I've had to sort of pick and choose whether I would be prioritizing my queerness or my Blackness, especially in the dating world. I feel like when I'm having like a romantic person, or honestly just even a friend, I feel like I'm sort of forced to choose whether I am going to be, you know, seeking out someone who will respect and understand my Black identity or my trans identity. And it is very rare that I find someone who will be able to fully understand both. So I think that's kind of how it's affected me.
So I'm non-binary and I'm half Indian, half white. So I feel like having both of those things, I struggled with both of them. With being non-binary, it was just like I didn't know what my gender was for a very long time. And then with being half Indian and half white, I struggled with being able to like fully embrace being Indian because so many people didn't really see me as Indian, they just saw me as white. And it's a similar thing with being non-binary. So many people just see me as a girl, they don't see me as non-binary. So I feel like those two things, I sort of had to deal with similar issues in both aspects of my life. And I feel like it was a kind of long struggle with trying to fully accept both of those identities.
Yeah, I feel like I've had to pick and choose like a lot of times between my blackness and my gayness. Also because while I was struggling with racial issues while I was a kid, I had to, you know, kind of figure out who I was, and I was confused. And it's like, I feel like I really didn't have a lot of access to like things to help me figure out my identity and stuff like that. And it kind of felt like, you know, oh, I'm already black. Why do I want to say that I'm gay and make my life harder, you know?
If everyone is ready to move on to the next question, in that case, what do you wish white queer people and white cishet people knew about being a queer person of color?
One thing would be there's a lot of pressure within the queer community about coming out and like how you need to do it or else like you're not really queer or you don't like fully accept your identity if you don't come out. But a lot of white queer people have to understand that it's very different coming out for people of color, especially if you're in a house of immigrants. Like I'm a second generation immigrant, I think, so my grandparents immigrated from India, and I don't know how I would like have that conversation with them because I don't think they fully understand what being non-binary is, and I have no idea how they would react. So it's very different when you're talking to a person who has grown up in America and might be more familiar with those terms than if you're talking to someone who hasn't and who doesn't really know what you're talking about and who might also not accept it even if they did know what you were talking about.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I am a first-generation Ethiopian immigrant, so most of my family, at least on my dad's side, lives in Ethiopia and has never lived anywhere else, or if it was for a very short amount of time. I have a decent amount of family that lives in the US, and they've been okay about it. But when I first came out, it was really difficult to get people on board, and a lot of that is because Ethiopia is not a very queer-friendly society or culture at this point in time. It is just like not a safe place to be out in queer, especially out in trans. And my dad definitely expressed that to me when I had first come out. He described my aunt's potential reaction to my transness as devastating, which just shows you how severe the like anti-queerness is in Ethiopia right now. And on the flip side, I don't think I could give up my family even if their reaction to my coming out was very severe, because they are my only connection to my homeland and my culture. And I think that sort of situation is something that white queer people oftentimes can't relate to if they aren't children of immigrants, because I think in the queer community we do have a lot of found family type culture and like this idea that you can build a new family if your original one is not as accepting as, you know, you want them to be. But that's very difficult for me. I would not be able to connect to my culture in the same way if I didn't have my family. And so I think that's a sort of perspective that white queer people don't get.
Yeah, just going off of that, my mom's side of the family immigrated from Cambodia, and I had a conversation with someone once when I was talking about coming out, and they were like, well, like, I guess, how do I put this? Like, worst comes to worst, like, they cut you off and that's fine, like, you'll be fine without them. But I was like, that's not true, because I need them, you know, for my culture. So it's like you said.
So I identify as Asian American, and my family dynamic is kind of in a rocky spot right now. So growing up, my family's always been like very academically straightforward. Like everything was about grades and doing well in school and extracurriculars. So I never really had that time to like figure out who I was like sexually, like for my sexuality. So I don't want to say it was like suppressed, but I was just never given that opportunity or that chance to just explore who I was. And so right now, I did figure out a way to do that, like even if it was just by myself or with a couple close friends. So currently I'm not actually out to my family yet because of just the relationship we have right now between like my home life and who I want to be.
I think going back to Nat's question, I think it's really important for others to know, especially allies, to listen to our stories and to validate our experiences. And then I think it's really important to stay engaged and to ask questions, but also be really thoughtful about the questions that you are curious about. I think that's how we learn and how we can grow. I think it's important to know that we all can learn and grow. And for some of us, we have a responsibility to remember that. So that's what I wish others would know.
Also adding on to that, white people in the queer community need to realize that the stories of people of color and their representation is just as important as white queer representation, because the vast majority of LGBTQ representation in the media is white, and that leads to a lot of people of color who are queer not really seeing themselves represented, even if there is queer representation, just because they have different stories. And when only one of those stories is seen, it can lead to a lot of ignorance about the other story and a lot of people not realizing that there's another journey that a lot of people go on that is very different from the white journey.
Okay. Similar to some people were talking about coming out, the next question is, if you have come out, has your coming out story been different from white counterparts, and how so?
When I came out to my parents, I think it was definitely something new for them. They're very supportive now, but like one of the things that I couldn't do would be to come out to my extended Black family, mostly because I already know the reaction. I already know that it's just not gonna go well. And it's kind of hard seeing other people's families, you know, kind of accept white people, and, you know, it's kind of just like seen as normal, but growing up in a Black household, like it's not normal.
So I'm actually pretty lucky because on my mom's side, which is my Indian side, my aunt is gay and she came out like a long time ago. So a lot of our like more distant relatives, especially the ones who live in India, they don't really know or understand her identity, but my grandparents did have to like figure out how they were going to feel about that. So I am lucky to have some sort of history where they did have to like accept a person who is queer in their family. And so it makes it a little bit easier for me just so that they have like some experience with it. But gay and non-binary are obviously different things. So I didn't really come out. I just changed my pronouns on Instagram. And when my grandmother saw that, she was very confused, didn't really know what it meant. We still haven't fully addressed it, but she was concerned. So I feel like, I don't know, that was something that I had to deal with, and I had to like try and explain to her what it meant, even though it was kind of hard because there's not really a lot of non-binary people in India. So I feel like that's something that a lot of white queer people might not have to go through.
I already spoke on this a little bit, so I'll be quicker, but part of my sort of issues with coming out with my parents and to my family was that I am trans, so and not because, but part of my transition that I want to happen is medical transition and taking hormones. But I was denied that by my family for almost half a year, up until very, very recently. They were like, no, you are not doing that, for numerous reasons, but part of it was on my dad's part of the reason he would not want me to do that is because it would be impossible for me to hide my transition from my family. And it would make it, if I was sort of mid-transition where I didn't really pass as cis, but I didn't really pass as a cis woman either, I would not be able to return to Ethiopia. I would probably not be able to return until I looked like a cis man would. And then if I did, I would get a lot of weird questions from my family members like, who are you? And I couldn't say, oh yeah, like that guy's daughter, but because that would be outing myself. So we've had some very long conversations about how I'm going to approach our extended family, how I'm going to explain my existence to our extended family. And that was part of my coming out journey that I don't think a lot of people have experienced or know about, but it's very common for first-gen kids.
In my family, my mom is white and my dad is black. And when I talk about my own experience and understanding my own intersectionality, if you look at my mom's white family, they're pretty accepting of my gayness, but they take issue with my blackness. And then in my black family, they're okay with my whiteness, but they take issue with my gayness. And I've had black family completely write off me and my parents because of my decision to be gay. And that's been my experience for the last 15 years or so.
The next question is also a little bit similar to the last one. Do you feel that queer identity has become, do you feel like people's association with queer identity has been their picture in their head is of a white queer person? And if so, do you think that those associations have influenced how you, the process of how you figured out your identity and came to terms with that?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I not to get too personal. I've been getting personal this whole panel, but I like gaslit myself for years, thinking that I was like faking being gay, like whatever. And like I recloseted in my life twice because I just like did not see myself as valid in my, originally my lesbian identity and now like my trans identity. All the representation that queer people get in media, almost all, is so white. I mean, Heartstopper, I have not watched it. It is probably a good show, but I don't think I'm really going to be able to relate to the characters in the same way because, I am a very specific identity. I am a black trans man, and that is not something that is almost ever really represented in shows and stuff. And again, I said this at the beginning of the panel, but with my experiences as a black woman dealing with misogynoir and the masculinization of black women, I think that really deterred me from coming to terms with my transness because masculinity was always something that was imposed on me. But yeah, I just never felt safe in queer spaces. I would not feel safe in like online queer spaces or in real life queer spaces because they were so white and I would be microaggressed by, my queer peers. Oh, that rhymes, okay. That's weird. But I would be microaggressed and I would not feel like I was really understood because my experiences were so different from my white peers in the queer community.
When I was growing up, there were no queer people of color that were represented in the media whatsoever. And that's still a challenge today, for sure. And I remember, like, I had this, like, really negative idea about my queerness growing up just because of what happened to a lot of, or the few gay characters on TV. A lot of them were written off or killed. Or I think there's a famous hate crime against Matthew Shepard, which I'm not sure how many of you know about Matthew Shepard, but he was a white gay man who was a victim of a hate crime. He was beaten up and tied to a fence in the middle of Wyoming, and got worldwide coverage because of such a horrific incident. And I don't want to take away from that at all, but if you look at the number of queer people of color that were beaten or killed, it's way too high. And especially today, black trans women are beaten and killed so much, and nobody really bats an eyelash or bats an eye, whatever the saying is. But with Matthew Shepard, he was like the stereotypical blonde hair, blue-eyed, white man that was easy to feel sympathy for compared to other people who were different. And that made it really, really hard for me to come out. I think someone mentioned on this panel earlier, like, why would I want to be gay on top of being a person of color? Like, gosh, it's like double whammy. And that's why. Like, looking at how people grieved for Matthew Shepard but didn't grieve for any of the other numerous people of color that were beaten or murdered. That's what made it really challenging for me.
So I have not noticed a lot of bi representation in media, or not as much as I think there should be. And there's even less of Asian American queer people in media, like TV shows or just movies, anything. So I always had a representation of a white bi person, or all the stereotypes that came with that I saw on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all of that. And I was like, this isn't me. I don't do these things. I don't say these things. I don't wear these things. So as a bi person, I was like, who am I? Because I don't fit what society tells me what a bi person should be. But I felt like I was bi. So back to like the gaslighting bit, I was like, am I really bi? Am I faking this? Like, how can I? Because I felt like I was bi. Like, I wanted to be bi. but I also wanted to be accepted by society, my peers, my family. But so I struggled with that, and honestly, I still am.
Yeah, I also feel like since a lot of Asian American identities are heavily stereotyped, like Indian people in the media, a lot of times they aren't recognized as like that they could be queer just because all the stereotypes that are already on them just prohibit them from being queer. Like there's already very, very little Indian representation in Western media. And the Indian representation that there is like nerdy, awkward, kid, can't do sports, parents are really strict, has to get straight A's, super religious. Like none of them are queer partially because their identity is already so stereotyped that there's no room to like add in another thing that you can stereotype them with. So I just never saw Indian queer people in the media, and it was hard coming to terms with the fact that I could also be like non-binary and Indian when there was really no one that was.
Are people ready for the next question? Okay. So I am looking at some of the sent-in questions, and someone is curious as to what can not people who are not LGBTQ or people who are not people of color. How can they? What could they do to help support you in either aspect of your identity?
Just like when you're trying to advocate for either the LGBTQ community or people of color, include people who are both. Like don't focus on only white LGBTQ people or only cishet people of color. Include that there can be people who are both. Something that comes to mind is there was a comedian, Dave Chappelle, I think, who was talking about how, talking about discrimination against trans people and discrimination against black people. And he made it seem as if those were mutually exclusive. You could not be both. It was either you were trans or you were black, but you can be both. You can be both identities. So we have to include that when we're talking about one or the other. And do not ever compare homophobia and racism. Do not ever compare homophobia and racism. They are different things, and comparing them just makes people feel bad. It makes them feel like their issues or their struggles are not as bad as they may think they are. And it really just hurts people, and it's never helpful to compare different types of oppression. We should just try to eliminate oppression instead of trying to figure out which one's worse, because it really doesn't matter which one's worse, and it makes no sense to compare them.
Adding on to that, I think like just be mindful and like don't make assumptions. I've seen a lot of people like with black gay men, they are kind of surprised and they're like, oh, like that's kind of weird, or they, automatically assume, oh, since you're black, and a man, you have to be like hard and gangster, and like I don't associate being gay with that kind of stuff. So I think you just have to be careful of what you assume, and like don't put your stereotypes onto people of color and gay people.
I also think it's important to do some introspection of your own, reflect on your own sexuality, your own gender identity, and whatnot, and just ask yourself certain questions and do some research and feel free to reach out to people who you trust to get some more understanding and clarification on that. And I think that once you have a really better understanding of yourself, then I think it becomes a lot easier to be a more visible advocate for others.
I think this just goes without saying, just don't label us. You might think that someone is like gay or trans or whatever, but don't make the assumption that they actually are, because there's a chance that you're always wrong. So, yeah.
Next question. Cool. Someone has asked, what kinds of resources, well, as queer people of color, what resources or types of people do you wish you had access to, or there was just more access to in general, when coming out or talking about or thinking about identity?
When I'm reflecting on just like my journey of realizing that I was queer and trans and all that, I wish I had more figures in my life who were also trans and of color. It was just never a perspective I heard from, which again I think contributed to me not really realizing that I was both. I knew I was of color. That's so stupid. I've always known I'm black. I do not have any disillusions of that. But realizing that I was trans was very difficult because I never really talked to someone who was both black and trans. I have been going to school in a PWI, separate PWIs, since I was going to school. Like, I've always been educated in PWIs. And so, you know, you can imagine how hard it is to find people of color to be friends with, let alone queer people of color, let alone trans people of color. And I think it's part of the reason I never really, it's part of the reason I doubted myself so much, part of the reason I was sort of like pushed to recloset, because I never really had someone to talk to who shared my experiences. So I wish there were more online spaces, because it's kind of the only way you can get there, as much as online spaces can really suck. I wish there were more online spaces that were exclusive to queer people of color. I wish there were more organizations at my schools that were specifically for queer people of color, not one or the other. And thankfully, I am going to a college that has a much larger diversity rate than my previous schools do, and an affinity group that is specifically for people who are both of color and queer. So I'm hoping that I can find that there. But yeah, that's what I wish I had had.
I mean, also just like celebrities even who are both people of color and queer. Like, I know that's not really something that people can control, like which celebrities are queer, but having like role models who were queer Indian people would have been really helpful for me as a kid, or like fictional characters, or just somebody who I could look up to and relate to, even if I couldn't talk to them, would have been really great as a kid.
Something I wish I could have had more of was more like queer adults of color, because I have had teachers who are queer. I've had teachers who are people of color, but at least not to my knowledge, I don't know if I've had teachers who are queer people of color. Like, I remember when I was younger, I had this teacher who was a lesbian. I'm also a lesbian. And she was white, and I remember I was like, that is so cool that she is a lesbian. I wish I could do that, because I didn't even think it was like an option for me, because I never saw that as an option for me.
Does anyone have anything to add, or I can move on? Oh, okay.
I think it's so amazing hearing the youth of today use certain words like cishet and non-binary, and they use it so confidently. Like when I was growing up, no one ever talked about those things or knew what they were. And I wish I had that because I'm still learning those terms. And I think, here's the corny English teacher plug, but words are power. And having access to those words and that vocabulary just can make your life a lot easier and reach out to other people, or you'll be able to reach out to other people. And I didn't have that, and I didn't know what my identity was because I lacked the knowledge around the vocabulary, around helping explain and understand myself. So I think it's so amazing that you all know this and you can educate others, and others have educated you about this. And I think that's great because we didn't have that growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hold on. One person is wondering, what can North's administration do in both the short and the long term to better help the population of queer people of color at the school? If anyone has any sort of suggestions or ideas. If not, I can also move on.
I have one. Make the gender-neutral bathrooms better and cleaner. One of them does not flush. That is my only suggestion.
Yeah, I do. Gotta agree with you there. There are some.
Maybe like try and teach about queer people of color, like in history class. There are plenty of historical figures who were queer and it's never talked about, and some of them are people of color. And if we could talk about that when we talk about the historical figures, that'd be cool, because then people would see that it's a lot more common than they think, that all these historical figures who they've been hearing about forever, they're actually gay or bisexual or whatever. And it would be nice for both queer people who would get to see representation, and for non-queer people who could see that this is a really common thing and that it's a part of people who they've known about for forever.
And it would be nice to hire more teachers who identify as queer people of color. Yeah.
Awesome. A lot of you have said that it's more difficult to come out as a queer person of color. And given that there might be closeted people of color watching, do you have any advice for them, or things that you would just like, what would you tell them to feel safer or more comfortable, or just advice in general?
You don't have to come out to your family. That is not a required thing that you have to do. If you don't feel safe coming out to your family, if you don't want to lose your family and you feel like coming out would make you lose your family, you don't have to come out. Like, it does suck being closeted to your family, but if you feel like it sucks less to be closeted than it would to be out, stay in the closet. And if you want to come out to someone, pick a trusted friend who would not tell your family, of course. Don't pick a friend who would out you to your family. And maybe come out to them, or maybe pick a trusted adult who is not in your family, like a teacher. If you really trust a teacher, you can come out to them. Just, there are options other than telling your family. You do not have to tell your family. And if you can't think of anyone in your life who you think would be accepting, there are, you can come out to us if you want to. I'd be totally fine with it. Or you can try an online space. You can try to find people who you identify with online if you feel comfortable doing that. Just try and stay safe and know that coming out is not a requirement to being queer?
I think while your racial identity will definitely like coincide with your gender identity and your sexuality, just don't let it kind of stop you from figuring out yourself and figuring out who you are. A lot of times people have told me like, oh, you know, like you're black and you're gay, like that doesn't really make sense to me, or you know, like associate being gay with being white, and just remember that like that's not true.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. Like, coming out in media is represented as this like final step to your queer journey, and that's just not true. I had to come out like 3 times, I think, because I just kept changing. And also, like, you don't have to come out, and you can still be happy if certain people don't know. If you're trans and you do want to medically transition, I would say wait until you are financially stable enough that your parents won't kick you out, and that would be less catastrophic for you. I understand waiting is very difficult. I get that, but yeah, just be safe with it. Just try and like make sure at all times you are not, you know, putting yourself in more danger than you need to be. I have been in a place where my family did not accept medical transition, and it sucks, but there's going to come a time where you are financially stable enough and separate from your family enough where it is right for you to make that choice and start that process. And if your culture and your country of origin aren't, you know, the most friendly to LGBTQ plus stuff, queer stuff, don't go there until you are safe being there. That would just be my recommendation.
I just want to say that yes, you should first make sure that you're safe. But then with the actual process of coming out, it doesn't have to, like, it can sound scary, like, oh, I have to announce this big, huge revelation, but it doesn't have to be like that. You don't have to, like, sit everyone you know down and say, like, I'm blank. You can just bring it up, like, in passing. You can say, oh, I've been talking to this girl, or you could just, like, quietly change your pronouns if you want. You know, it doesn't have to be such a huge, daunting thing. Yeah.
Do any of you do you have any stories of moments of joy or euphoria being a queer person of color? It can relate to either aspect of, well, either part of your identity or both.
Okay, this might be a little gross to some people, but I don't care. As a black person, I have a lot of leg hair and arm hair, and that's very euphoric to me as a trans man. And I like being black and trans. I think it is so amazing that I am part of this very tight-knit, small community. I don't think I would trade it for the world. As much as it is tough sometimes, black people who are also trans are some of the strongest and most resilient people I know, and I'm just very happy to be walking among them. And I would not, if I had to do it over again, I would do exactly the same. I don't know what it is, but I would not want to not be black and trans, is what I'm trying to say. I think it is a really amazing life experience for me to have, as much as it sucks sometimes.
I guess there's this one show that I watched probably around a year ago. It's called Grand Army, and it was the first time I ever saw an Indian character who was queer. And it wasn't like really similar to me because it was a guy who was gay, So like there wasn't a whole lot that I felt was in common with me, but it just felt really, really great to like see a queer Indian person in television and to see that like I might have some representation and that I might like get some more as I grow up. It just felt really nice.
I think one of my happier moments was when I was first hired here at North a couple millennia ago. And I was talking with the department chair about books that are taught in the 9th grade. And I had mentioned how at my previous school, they were considering this one book called Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. And it features queer people of color. And my department chair, like the next day, she went out and bought it and read the book and was like, we should totally teach it. I think this is an appropriate book for 9th grade classes. And I thought, how cool was that? Like, here's a department chair who is like listening to the voice of a queer person of color, wanting to bring in queer people of color's voices into the classroom and actually like working with me, who was a brand new hire. And I just thought that that was such a really powerful moment. Now, I'm not saying Aristotle and Dante is the best book. It's got a few problems in it. And I think it's an amazing experience that like checked off a lot of my identity markers as queer, person of color, and teacher.
Does anyone else have anything? Okay. Someone is wondering do you think each like identity has affected how people who might identify with one part of that but not the other, for instance, a cishet person of color or a white queer person, do you think that has affected how people who are similar but not entirely the same identity, how they interact and treat and have conversations about either of those identities with you? If that makes sense. Sorry. That one's it.
Yeah, I feel like I can't hide that I'm a person of color, but I can hide the fact that I'm gay. And I've had quite a few people of color that I've come out to not want to be friends with me anymore, or, you know, be, you know, kind of iffy about it and distance themselves. And I think with white gay people, I think it's something that's like kind of an add-on that's like, oh, you know, oh, you're gay, like too, like I didn't know that. So I feel like it is something that's like, sorry, I don't really know where I'm going with this. It's something that's like an add-on to kind of me being a person of color. So I think it's kind of hard to manage that sometimes, like hard to come out with that, because I can be black, but it's like I'm also gay.
So for me, I feel like I can pretty easily pass for a white cishet person, which is something that I struggled with a lot because I felt like I wasn't Indian enough and I wasn't non-binary enough because I didn't look like how people normally thought those identities looked. And so in Indian spaces, a lot of people didn't really know that I was Indian. And in queer spaces, a lot of people didn't really know I was queer. So it was like an extra struggle for me because I felt like I didn't fully identify with the identity that they had, but then also I had an extra identity that they didn't identify with. And I just felt very different from both Indian cishet people and white queer people, because I felt like I just completely did not fit in with them.
I've had a similar experience where with black people, I'm not black enough because I'm half black, half white. And where I'm from, which is Bangor, Maine, I think it's one of the whitest cities in the country. I don't pass as white, but everyone thought I was Latino. And the same experience happens here at North. I get mislabeled a lot. In fact, I think the most recent one was 2 hours ago. So it happens all the time, and it's a bit of an ouch moment. And I understand the intent might be relatively harmless, but the impact is kind of hurtful. And in another situation, I was on we have a gay kickball league, like Stonewall Kickball, and I joined that last summer. And at one of the games, I was talking with another player who was so excited about the Eternals and how that's a Marvel movie, in case people didn't know. And he said, I'm so excited there are so many colored people in the cast. And for those of you that don't know, that's a very outdated, offensive phrase. We don't say that, we say people of color. And so I said, I think you mean people of color. And he goes, oh, sorry, whatever, it's the same thing. And it's like, okay, like even, and within those communities, there's still that challenge of being able to reflect and take in feedback. And that hurt. It sucked, you know? But yeah, so I think that kind of answers your question.
A lot of non-white and non-Western cultures have connections to queerness that differ from traditional, more Western ideas of queerness. And have these cultures or ideas of queerness influenced your own idea of that or connection to your own identity?
So, in I think Hinduism, which is not the religion that my family is part of, but it is an Indian religion, there are deities who have forms that are not their, like, how do I say this? They have multiple forms that may be different genders, or they might not have a gender because they're like higher than people and they just don't really conform to those type of human things. I don't really know. So I feel like that sort of helped me because I saw that, like, in the literal religion or one of the religions of the country that my family's from, there are like gods who do not conform to like a gender binary, which was interesting. Again, it's not really like my family's religion, but it was nice to see that there was a religion that had gods who didn't fit the Western gender binary.
Kind of similarly, I know that there were a lot of pre-colonial African religions that included, you know, trans and non-binary people as different sort of like religious figures and also just like in society. I personally don't, unfortunately, know a lot about Ethiopian pagan views on this because I'm part of only 2 tribes in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never really officially colonized, so a lot of our pagan rituals are still intact. My grandmother still practices a lot of them, but I don't unfortunately know a lot about them in connection to queerness. But obviously it was sort of part of learning about my own queerness was learning that it is in, you know, a lot of other Black people's ancestry and a lot of other African people's ancestry. And I think that's just a cool thing, and it sucks that colonialism has really ripped that sort of connection away from a lot of people of color. Yeah.
And I think we are probably going to be wrapping this up soon, but we have one more question. Hold on. Someone is asking how, so the LGBTQ community often appropriates the cultures of people of color into its own, queer culture, and they mostly appropriate Black culture. How does this appropriation intersect with your own identity as LGBTQ plus people?
Frankly, it's like kind of annoying when I see white gay people using AAVE or Black slang, especially a lot of times I've seen them use it as something that's like funny, like using the words wrong, like calling somebody bussin'. Like, I don't know, I don't think that's funny, but I think it just makes me really uncomfortable having to sit through that and like hear people do that. Or when I see specifically white queer men, you know, doing their edges or kind of taking their personality from Black women, it makes me very uncomfortable. And I think my thoughts are just be mindful kind of what you're doing, because when us Black women act as ourselves and, you know, use Black slang, we're seen as ghetto. But when you do it, you know, you're seen as funny, and, you know, you get 1 million followers on TikTok, and, you know, people are laughing at you and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, just like be yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The way that some white gay men will speak is like genuinely jarring to me, because it's like, you are from Newton. You do not sound like that naturally. Where did you learn that? Like, and I think a lot of it is because queerness can make someone, this is not to defend it, like I hate those kinds of people, like they make me angry. But I think a lot of it is that queerness makes someone feel very alienated from like dominant white American culture. And so for a lot of white gay people, like the next thing that they jump to is appropriating Black culture, because it is the only thing that they can leech onto to find some sort of like new identity after their like, you know, Wonder Bread nuclear family identity was sort of taken from them by their queerness. And it speaks to the way that a lot of white gay people view Blackness as somehow rebellious or countercultural, or like, I don't know, it's just like weird, like it's gross. And it can be frustrating as a Black queer person, because like I think a lot of Black queer people bring their own Black identity into spaces that are meant for other Black queer people, and then white people sort of hear them and take it for themselves. So it's just frustrating, and also like proves that Black queer people are literally the blueprint, like we're all being copied.
Unless anyone else has anything to add, I think that's where we should end. We have 2 minutes of the block left. But thank you so much for coming up here and sharing your stories and your experiences. And thank you everyone who sent in questions. And just thank you everyone who came to Be Glad Day. Yeah, thank you so much.